Hello, this is the fifth and last lecture in a series of lectures on the principles and practice of using woody plants in the landscape as part of the Woody Landscape Plants course in the Prairie Horticultural Certificate Program. Today I'm going to talk about mainly the principles of design and how they apply to using woody plants, and a little bit about creating a detailed landscape plan. Now, the 6 principles that I will talk about, and I want you to be clear that these are different than the design elements that we talked about, but you'll see how they relate as we go through, are repetition, variety, balance, sequence, emphasis, and scale or relative proportion. Repetition, as the name would imply, is the repeating of objects or certain design elements throughout the landscape. Things like vertical lines, for example, or certain colors or certain textures and so on. So you really are taking the design elements and you're applying those to a certain principle, or applying a principle to those design elements is a better way to put it. Repetition can help tie a landscape together, create what's sort of sometimes termed a sense of rhythm. You can certainly see in this repetition of elms in the street in Winnipeg, it's definitely tying that whole block together, and you can use this, strategically in your yard landscape to tie one side of the yard together and create it as I say, a kind of a sense of rhythm. However, if you use it too much, it can get a little monotonous, so be careful. The corollary, or the opposite of this in some ways, is the next principle, which is the whole idea of creating variety in your landscape. So it is the absence of uniformity or repetition. And this means you change or contrast the elements of design that we've been discussing. And this photograph here shows a lot of variation in color. You can see differences in texture. You can see differences in line. You've got vertical and more horizontal lines. So you can see all of, and you also have differences in size, which is another aspect you can look at too. So really you can see that there's quite a bit of variety here. It has to be, it does make a landscape very interesting, but there's a couple of things. If you do it too much, it can look rather busy, and then you don't get the unity in your design. And also, if it's not done well, it just doesn't look good, because you have to know what you're doing. You have to put these together with a bit of an artistic flair, or at least it's a good idea. The third principle I want to talk about is the principle of balance. Now, balance is just meaning that if you look at the landscape, you're going to feel like it's not tilting to one side or the other, basically, visually. It doesn't have to be a perfect balance, but it should be that you don't feel like it's leaning to that one side and taking your eye only to one side at the expense of the other. It doesn't really have to be it is not really necessarily a physical balance necessarily. You don't have to have everything on each side or so on. It's kind of more of an illusion. You get a sense of illusion just from making sure that objects are placed properly, having certain characteristics. It can give a sense of balance rather than feeling of out of balance. Want to make sure that there's a so-called symmetrical balance, which I'm not going to illustrate, but that would be where you have exactly the same thing on one side of the yard than the other, the same plants, the same everything. Probably a better way to look at balance in the landscape is to use what's called asymmetrical balance, which means it's balanced so that when you look at it, you don't feel that sense of out of balance or leaning to one side or the other. But it doesn't mean that everything's exactly the same on each side. As I said, it's more of an illusion of physical balance. So here's a good example, you could say, of a balanced landscape where you have a fairly large tree over here, and then a couple of smaller, narrow trees on this side. And basically that's not the same, but there is kind of a balance, so it's an asymmetrical balance from one side to the other. Sequence is very important in landscape. I already alluded to this in terms of size when I talked about the beds. I said that most people tend to start with a smaller plant at the front of a bed, say if you're against the fence or something, and then work upwards towards the back so it's taller. And you can see that in this particular photograph here. You've got, these are a lot larger plants, but these are all shrubs, but you can see the smaller shrubs, the medium shrubs, and the taller one at the back. You can also see that sequence is not just about size, it's also the design elements again. You can have sequence of all the design elements that we've talked about, such as forms, texture, colors. You could even have a sequence as a line. This particular photograph shows mainly, although there's variation in texture, I wouldn't say it's necessarily that much of a sequence, but certainly you have a sequence of colors from the sort of reddish purple to the white to the green at the back. And you can use sequence to actually take your eye and pull the person's eye and the attention to a specific, say, a feature at the back of it. If maybe if you wanted to feature this plant, this kind of draws your eye up the scale right to the back, and you can see this plant at the back. So sequence is very important. Another one that's quite important is we talked about variety, but sometimes within variety there's more to it than just having a bunch of different plants. Sometimes you want one plant that is particularly dominant. It differentiates the sort of a particular individual plant or some kind of an element that you want from the less important parts of the landscape. So you might build it around this particular plant or feature. Now again, it isn't just sizes that it can be dominant. It can be certain other design elements. Some of the design elements, such as color, might be something that's really a dominant feature in one spot or in certain spots, and that's what you sort of build your landscape around. To give you an idea of a dominant, trees are often the dominant feature, and you can see here is just a tree in front of the landscape. This is the dominant feature that that you could consider that the rest of the landscape's built around. It's not necessarily probably put there for that particular reason, but it definitely is a dominant feature in the landscape. Sort of, and you can see another example of a dominant evergreen in a front yard of another house. Leading to the next and last feature, or I'm sorry, principle, is the concept of relative scale or proportion, which can relate back a little bit to the previous one of emphasis, especially when you have large trees. So you can use plants of different size, for example. We're talking mostly size here. Is that you can use plants to actually modify the illusion of size of other objects in the landscape. So it will have you can vary this quite a bit, and it can actually change how you view the landscape. For example, if you think about this picture, you can see this large tree. This is a 2-story house, or at least a 1.5-story. Pretty big house, but this large tree makes this house look small. If you had just took that tree out and you just had small plants in front of the house, that would make that house look quite large. So you can change the relative scale of the landscape just by what you put in there in terms of plant material. Just another example of that is to show how this large building, this is the legislative building in Winnipeg, you can see that's a big building, and it makes these little, these are large elm trees, but look at how small they look relative to the building. So it's all a matter of scale. So you can take those kinds of principle, and you can apply that to your landscape to be careful that you don't want if you don't want your house to just look too dominant, you can use plants to pull that size down and so on. So just to kind of summarize a little bit, you can take the elements of design, such as form, line, color, texture, which we've discussed previously, and you can use these in the principles of design to achieve a specific effect. Put another way, you could look at unity in design basically is what you're trying to create. You're trying to create a design that really looks good when you look at it as the big picture, I guess you could say. So unity is attained when you apply the design principles of repetition, variety, balance, emphasis, sequence, scale, and proportion to the design elements of form, line, color, and texture. So you can, if you apply those design principles to those design elements, you would hopefully get a good, design that has a nice unity that hangs together well. I just want to say a few words about the kinds of plans. We've talked about assessment plans, concept plans, and now I want to talk a little bit about the sort of final detail plan, which is sort of what you have in your assignment without the plants in it, of course. And it just really, all a detailed plan is one where you have the plant material is put in, the numbers of them, the spacing of them, the size is accounted for, and of course the names are all put there. So basically it has to go along with a list, and you can see that here it says that there are 2 ABAs concolor, you can see that that's what you have here, and this is on your plan. This is how I want you to do your plan too, is to have, if you have two plants, join them out and then put your label further out. So I would like to see, and it's all in your handout as well. Another kind of plan that you might see is what's kind of sometimes, I don't know what it's called exactly myself, but I kind of call it an intermediate plan, where it's got a little bit more detail than just the concept plan, where it actually shows the plants a little bit, and sometimes even maybe a large tree in this case, but it doesn't necessarily have to specify what it is. In this case, it just says, and here it might just say summer planting. It says over here evergreen planting, shrub rows, but it doesn't really get into the details, or the scale's not perfect, but it's getting closer. So it's a little bit. I like this as a kind of another kind of I guess you could say a more elaborate concept plan. So just to look at the progression to finish off, you've got your basic schematic or your bubble diagram, and this can also lead, if you will, or it can be replaced by what I call the intermediate plan, and then of course you can move from there to the more detailed plan with a specific plant material on there and the list that accompanies it. So that ends the series of lectures on this, and hopefully this series of lectures will be helpful in the assignment 2 on the landscape plan, and also even towards just the course in general. But again, I want to emphasize that this material is not specifically required for any exam.